In the Thracian plain, the frost bites to the bone. Thousands of soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder, their breath rises like ghosts over their iron helmets. The earth is dry and cracked, but not silent, it holds decaying memories of past wars. On the horizon, drums are beating beyond the low hills. But this sound does not belong to Rome. It is heavier, darker. And it is the sound of something that has been approaching ceaselessly for years. Emperor Valens gazes toward the horizon and must make a decision. By the end of the 2nd century, Rome was no longer just a city. Rome was a world unto itself. This empire, stretching from the misty highlands of Britannia to the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia, had bound together millions of lives through a single constitution, a single currency, and a network of roads extending farther than the eye could see. The Pax Romana, as it was also known, lasted for many years. Engineers, philosophers, merchants, and soldiers traveled throughout this vast empire, speaking the same language wherever they went and finding the same courts, the same laws, and the same assurance of order. According to most, this was one of the greatest achievements in human history. But unfortunately, empires have a tendency to consume themselves from within. By the 3rd century, things were beginning to go awry in the empire. Agricultural productivity, which had relied on slave labor, was declining. The empire's long, unprotected borders were under attack nearly every night by tribes that no longer feared the legions as they once had. The imperial treasury was being plundered constantly. Emperors came and went at an alarming rate, some were felled by a dagger in the dark within a matter of months. Historians would later refer to this period as the crisis of the 3rd century, but for those who lived through those days, it felt less like a crisis and more like a slow suffocation. Rome had reached the brink of collapse. Emperor Diocletian emerged from this ruin and made a difficult decision. In 284 AD, he divided the empire into two, Eastern and Western Rome. He believed that such a vast structure could no longer be governed by a single throne. This was a strategic move, perhaps even a masterstroke. But at the same time, it sowed the seeds of a division that would gradually take root, seeds that would divide their resources, their loyalties, and ultimately their destinies. The Eastern Roman Empire grew stronger. It became wealthier. It became more administratively organized. For the West, however, the situation was exactly the opposite. Having lost its balance, it entered a long period of decline. Economic collapse, political instability, and the relentless pressure of migrating peoples eroded its foundations like water wearing away stone. In 410 AD, the Visigoth king Alaric sacked the Western Roman Empire's capital, a city that had not seen foreign soldiers for 8 centuries. This was as much a psychological shock as it was a physical one. If Rome could fall, what could not? Then came the Vandals. Then the Huns. The borders began to shrink steadily. And on September 4, 476, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, the young Romulus Augustulus, who bore the name of Rome's founder and first emperor, was quietly deposed. There was no great battle. There was no final stand. Just a document, a forced surrender, and silence. The Western Roman Empire was gone. But its downfall did not begin with these events. It had begun nearly a century earlier, in the summer of 378 AD, at a place called Adrianople. The Goths had crossed the Danube, fleeing the Hun pressure coming from the east. They sought refuge from the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire accepted them and then began to exploit them. Corrupt bureaucrats seized their food and forced their people into slavery. The Goths revolted, and a Roman army marched out to meet them near Adrianople. Eastern Emperor Valens arrived in the region before the cavalry of Western Emperor Gratian could reach it. His officers urged Valens to wait. The cavalry from the west would arrive in the region within a few days. Valens could not wait. Whether out of ambition, pride, or a misjudgment of the battlefield, he gave the order to advance. Roman reconnaissance units were attacked on the flanks by Gothic cavalry. The Roman lines first weakened, then collapsed. Some of the empire's finest legions were no more. Valens died somewhere on that battlefield. His body was never found. This was not merely a military defeat. It revealed a truth that Rome's enemies had long suspected: the empire was not invincible. The barbarians' confidence grew, Rome's former momentum never fully returned. The wall that had been thought unbreakable had fallen, and no stone could rebuild it. But what if a different instinct had kicked in during that battle? What if Valens, spotting the Gothic cavalry on the horizon, had ordered his officers to withdraw and told them to wait? The Roman army maintained its formation as the sun set. The Goths probed the lines, found no weakness, and retreated. That night, the campfires of both sides burned. The battle did not begin. In the early hours of the morning, a dust cloud rose from the western road. Gratian's cavalry had arrived on time, just as promised. The battle began after the Western Roman cavalry arrived. The Romans fought with their formation intact, their ranks tight, and their commanders in perfect coordination. The Gothic cavalry charged but achieved nothing. As the battle wore on, the Gothic cavalry grew weary and found themselves surrounded. Eventually, the Gothic formation collapsed. The survivors fled north of the Danube. Rome achieved an absolute victory. And this victory came about as a result of a single, different decision made in a single afternoon. Everything began to be rewritten. The political balance shifted instantly. A victorious Rome at Adrianople had no need for the desperate and poorly managed settlement conditions imposed by the Goths. It saw the consequences of the barbarian tribes on the northern frontier and hesitated. The wall, once deemed unbreakable, still stood firm. Valens and Gratian, realizing how close the disaster was, began to cooperate more closely. The division between East and West would never happen again. The structure established by Diocletian ran very deep. Instead of drifting apart, the Eastern and Western Roman empires began to reinforce one another. The foederati system, which facilitated the integration of barbarian peoples into the Roman army, was reorganized not out of desperation but through discipline. The barbarians served Rome. Economic reforms were introduced. The tax system was restructured around smaller, accountable regional administrators. Trade routes were fully secured by the empire. Money didn't lose its value. In the 5th century, as Attila and the Huns laid Europe to waste, they encountered something different from what they had encountered in history. Not a fragmented West struggling to survive, but a Rome that had spent the past 70 years rebuilding its confidence, order, and goals. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, which in real history barely managed to halt Attila, led this time to a more decisive outcome. The Hun Empire fell apart. Rome did not celebrate its survival. Instead, it began to expand cautiously once more. By the 6th century, the world had changed beyond recognition. The Frankish kingdoms, the Visigothic states, and the small Germanic kingdoms that made up medieval Europe no longer existed. The people were incorporated into Rome, governed, taxed, educated, and over time, they became Romanized. Latin evolved as it always had, but it did not split into languages like French, Spanish, Italian, or Portuguese. There was a single language, a single law. Great libraries did not burn, like those in Alexandria, Constantinople, or Rome itself. The knowledge accumulated by the ancient world, in mathematics, medicine, engineering, and philosophy, was not lost in fire and destruction. It was copied, debated, and developed. In the 9th century, Roman engineers studied steam and pressure with systematic curiosity. Viewed from a distance, this resembled the first steps of the industrial age. The printing press, the telescope, the theory of microbes. There was no need to wait for the Renaissance. A dark age was never experienced. But this world was not as beautiful as it was imagined to be. A civilization of this magnitude and continuity did not naturally produce the creative destruction brought about by collapse and rebirth. Instead of the chaotic productivity once created by rival kingdoms through war, invention, and borrowing from one another, it turned toward consolidating a unified Roman order. Orthodoxy, the weight of tradition. The opposition was not set free, it was controlled. Peripheral cultures, such as the Celts and the Germanic peoples, continued to exist within the Roman framework but could not fully develop on their own. The nation-state democracies that emerged from the ruins of medieval Europe did not form in the same way. Individual rights developed in different forms and through different processes. And yet, much of the suffering that accompanied Rome's actual collapse, centuries of plague, famine, and war, simply never occurred. History rarely unfolds where we expect it to. It does not collapse or endure in the grand moments we remember. It unfolds through smaller events, in an emperor's impatience, in a cavalry unit spotted or overlooked on a dusty plain. In 378 AD, on a battlefield in Thrace, a man made a decision. And the world became what it is today. If a different decision had been made, the world might have turned into something entirely different, perhaps more whole, but more stagnant. More stable, but perhaps less free. It's not simply a matter of better or worse. It's just complete. That is the weight of a single decision. And that is why history, even when it has come to an end, never quite finishes with us. Every decision we make shapes the future.